Okay, I know today's the day after St. Patrick's Day, but couldn't have class yesterday, so we're my St. Patrick's Day outfit. But does anybody know Michael Murray, who is in institutional advancement? He was in career services. Anyway, he's at the college. So one of the first times I saw him, I was wearing this outfit, this jersey, and it's from a race in 2002 called Shamrock and Shenanigans, and it was sponsored by Connor O'Neill's in Ann Arbor. I don't know if you've ever been to Ann Arbor, but Connor O'Neill's put a plug in for him. Anyway, I had won this race back when I used to be Gary Wolfram, and now I'm just what's left of Gary Wolfram. But anyway, Professor Steele's trying to get me to get back. And so, has anybody run with Professor Steele at all or gone to any of the races that he talks about? No. He's always trying to get people to go to these races. But bottom line is, it turns, so Michael Murray says, how'd you get that shirt? And that's what I told him. So he said, well, my brother owns Connor O'Neill. So that's how we got to get started. So, all right. We're a little off schedule because Friday before we went on break, I didn't bring in the classic album. So I'll do it today. And Wednesday, I'll do a band pick of the week. But this is Simon and Garfunkel's Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme album. This is the classic Simon and Garfunkel album. It's got Scarborough Fair on this. It was called 59th Street Bridge Songs on here. Dangling Conversation. There's all sorts of really good songs on this classic. You see they've got flowers around, and so anyway, classic Simon and Garfunkel from the day. I don't know exactly when this was. Does it have a date on it? Doesn't really have a date on it. So, and it is. Is this in stereo? Yes, it's in stereo. So let's be up to date. All right. So last time we were talking about Hayek's Constitution of Liberty. That we talked about, we're trying to limit the total amount of coercion that government can do, right? We're giving a monopoly of coercion over to our government because we want to limit the total amount of coercion, we want to minimize the total amount of coercion. In the absence of government, then the strong will prey upon the weak. So then the question becomes, how do we limit that government? And one of the things we talked about last time was the rules of the game ought to be general in the sense that you shouldn't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. That is, again, when we talk about playing Monopoly, you have to decide before you start the game whether you're going to get money when you land on free parking or not. We want people to know what that when they're implementing the law or making the law, we want to make sure that they understand that I can't use it to go after a certain group of people. If I could know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply, then I could go after this group or go after that group and be coercive. Whereas if I don't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply, then it will be more difficult for me to be coercive. If I write the law, I won't know whether it's going to apply to my grandmother or it's going to apply to this group of people that I don't like. If we set the principle that says you can know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply, then it might work out well for them to start with. But once I have that principle set there, then I can undertake actions that would be coercive to them. Maybe it's good for, if we go back to Germany of the pre-World War II, then what happened was you had rules that applied just to Jews, okay? And that turned out to be bad for them. But I couldn't have had that law if what happened was it was going to apply to everybody. If we're going to put everybody and round them up and put them in cattle cars and do bad things to them, then I probably wouldn't have passed that law to start with. So we need to know beforehand to whom the law is going to, we can't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. We said that rules like thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not steal, those are general in the sense that I don't know beforehand who's going to be stealing, who's going to be murdering, etc. And then that led us to chapter 2, where we said the main contention of this chapter is that the case for individual freedom rests chiefly on the recognition of the inevitable ignorance of all of us concerning many of the factors on which the achievement of our ends and welfare depend. Again, that is this idea that information is decentralized, same thing that Misa was talking about. And I can't know what's best for you, nor may you know what's exactly best for you. You have to have the ability to go out and experiment. You have to have the ability to try this occupation or to try this product or etc. And so when you, if you're going to be free, then you have to have that, that ability to choose amongst those things. And why do I want you to be free? I want people to be free because information is decentralized, right? And so this idea that we should allow people to make the best use of this decentralized information. Then he says that, so then we moves on to chapter 3 here. And in chapter 3, what he's talking about is social evolution. Chapters 3 and 4 both are a discussion about social evolution. And what Hayek argues here is that successful societies are copied as if they're successful, they're copied. And if you're unsuccessful, then you go out of business, essentially. So we don't have today where anybody is out there sacrificing virgins to the gods in order to improve agricultural productivity, right? That we used to do things that way. We don't do that anymore. We don't, if we go to Western Europe or anywhere really, you don't see castles, and that's the way they organize themselves. You know, unless you watch Bud Light commercials, it appears that there are still people that do that. But that's really not the case, right? So what happened was we didn't just like one day wake up and say, oh, feudalism doesn't work very well because they make their beer using corn syrup. It just gradually over time, what happened when we read How the West Grew Rich will develop this, but gradually over time, successful societies outcompete unsuccessful ones, right? So we have successful societies outcompete unsuccessful ones. And just looking around historically, that's the way it works, right? You don't have pharaohs in Egypt any longer. You don't have the Aztec culture is no longer there. The Aztec Empire is no longer there. The Inca Empire is no longer there. What happens? Notice what's happening in China. In China, we've talked about this, but in China, since when it moved towards a market sort of based system in 1978 was where it started to do that. Between 1980 and 2015, 800 million people move out of poverty in China. So what's China doing? China looks a lot more like a market-based system today than it did in 1970. And that has been successful. Now, China's got a bunch of problems. Its economic growth is slowing, et cetera. And a good deal of that has to do with the fact that they didn't move completely towards market capitalism. They have all these state-owned enterprises, and there's all sorts of problems that China has because it hasn't moved all the way towards market capitalism. But what Hayek would argue is that eventually we expect that to happen. Hayek argues that that Charles Darwin, his idea of evolution in biology was actually borrowed from Scottish and British political philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries. That is that Darwin didn't invent this idea of evolution. This idea of social evolution has been around for a long time, and that Darwin was able to take that idea and adopt it into adapt it into biology. And he says that that basically most of the advances that we've seen in the world started in the West, and when these successful ways of organizing ourselves are being copied by the rest of the world. Chapter 4 also talks about that. Again, chapters 3 and 4 are this long discussion about social evolution and how it develops. And in chapter 4 is where he brings up what he calls spontaneous order. And, we've talked about this several times, right? What happens what we've done is we've moved towards well, first of all, no one wakes up and says, oh my gosh, this feudal system that we've been under for 500 years just doesn't really work. How about we just do market capitalism, okay? That's not the way it happened. What happened was over time, it moved towards market capitalism. And what is market capitalism? It's a spontaneous order in the sense that, what do we know happened in New York City today, right? 9 million people woke up in New York City. There's exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee and exactly the right amount of peanuts and bagels and everything else, okay? So it's orderly, right? There's not disorder. We didn't wake up like we would if we'd been in Venezuela. If you woke up in Venezuela today, it wouldn't be orderly. But it's spontaneous, okay, in the sense that no one's in charge of it, right? The price system tells entrepreneurs about what's going on with people's demands, that profit attracts firms into those industries where your guys' demand is increasing. When your demand increases, the prices go up and profit rises and other firms enter and resources move that way. If your demand goes down, just the opposite happens, right? Prices fall, people stop producing, they leave the market. And so resources move back and forth through the spontaneous order of the market. There's no one in charge of that. And so he's basically saying that successful innovations move ahead and are adopted by other places. The way that we do agriculture has been adopted in India and has been adopted in other parts of the world. Agricultural productivity has been going up. Why and where do innovations happen? Right, innovations happen in the West, and then they disperse throughout the rest of the world. That's what Hayek is talking about, and this is 1960 that he's talking about this. But we know that where does the Ebola vaccine get developed? It gets developed in the West, and then it gets moved towards Democratic Republic of Congo, where it's needed. Then chapter 5 then leads us to a chapter that we're going to talk more about, is this idea of responsibility. And responsibility is an important concept in a market system. He says, a free society will not function or maintain itself unless its members regard it as right that each individual occupy the position that results from his action and accept it as due to his own action. Okay? A free society will not function or maintain itself unless its members regard it as right that each individual occupy the position that results from his action and accept it as due to his own action. So what does that say? Your position in life is due to your own action. Your position in life is due to your own actions. And people have to believe it, right? And they have to accept it. Okay? Oops, not acceptance. Actions. Okay? And we have to accept this. And why is that? Because the way this market system works, right, is you get paid the value of your marginal product, right? If you're very productive, if the value of what you produce is very large, you're going to get paid the value of your marginal product. And that's going to make it so that resources are going to move about in the most efficient fashion. If you're not very productive, then you're going to end up living in a van down by the river. That's what's going to happen. Okay, and you have to accept that that's the way it's going to work. Okay, so when you guys go to graduate, what's going to happen? You're going to have to go out there and find what the thing is that you can do that's going to make you productive, that you can provide the most output for, and the most valued output for. And so this idea of people have, in order for the market system to work, we've got to accept this as well. We have to say, hey, I understand this is how it works, and I'm going to accept that's how we operate. If you guys don't accept that, if you don't think that you ought to be responsible for your actions, that your position in life is not due to your actions, but due to the powerful folks that have made it difficult for you to succeed, if that's what you think, then what are you going to try to do? You're going to overthrow the system, right? And if you overthrow the system, then what will happen is we won't be as wealthy, right? The market system is the system that creates the most wealth, particularly wealth for the poor, right? And if you don't believe in the system, then you'll overthrow it. He says that a voluntary social cooperation, which is what market capitalism is about, right? This is what Mises talks about. And when we first talked about this, right, voluntary cooperation is the key to markets, to the market system. And so if we're going to have this market system, it's a system what? We talked about this at the very beginning. It's based on voluntary exchange, right? That's one of the foundations of how markets work, right? It's a system of voluntary exchange. If it's a system of voluntary exchange, then then people have to be rewarded based on the value of what they produce, and you have to believe that it's fair, right? If you don't believe it's fair, then it's not going to stay around. So when you listen to people running for president of the United States, you might listen to whether they think that the market system's fair, right? And if they tell you that the market system's not fair, then what are they going to do? They're going to say, hey, we ought to get rid of the market system. And once you do that, a free society requires more than any other that people be held responsible for their actions. That's what Hayek says here. So if you want to give up freedom and you want to give up the market system, then that's okay. You just have to realize that if you believe that people aren't responsible for their actions, then that's what's going to happen. Then he says that a free society only offers choices; it can't guarantee outcomes, right? So a free society can't guarantee outcome. It can only offer choices. What is freedom about, right? It's the ability to act according to your own plan. That's how we describe freedom. That's how we describe liberty. Notice this sounds exactly like Bastiat. And what did Bastiat say? Bastiat said a just law can only do what? Can only allow you the free and inoffensive use of your faculties to try to make yourself better off. That's exactly what Hayek is saying here, that a free society can't guarantee outcomes. It can only give you choices. Now, if you are the poor little match girl, then what's going to happen? You're going to be the poor little match girl until bad things happen to you. I don't want to give the story away. If you ever read that story. Why it's a Christmas story, I don't know. But anyway, bummer happens at the end. But anyway, you're the poor little match girl. You're not going to get rich. Why not? Because what's the value of your marginal product? It's going to be really low, right? You're selling matches. And so you'd have to sell a heck of a lot of matches in order to become wealthy. So what's going to happen? You're going to be poor. Now, again, as when we pointed this out in Bastiat, he says that a voluntary society, you can have voluntary association, because what do you need to do? If we're not going to have government engaged in legalized plunder, if the way we're going to take care of the poor is that the government's not going to do it, then we need to do it. Right? And he says the only way that you can have true philanthropy is if you guys get to decide, hey, I want to give my money away. And he said it's not philanthropic when the government takes your stuff and gives it to somebody else. That's what he calls false philanthropy. Right? Because when the government takes your stuff, it's not being philanthropic. You're not being philanthropic because the government's taking your stuff away. And so there is no philanthropy when that happens. And so he says that, basically a fear of responsibility entails a fear of freedom. A fear of responsibility is a fear of freedom. You don't want to be free because what does freedom require? Right? What does he say? A free society can't guarantee you outcomes, right? It can only offer you choices. So you're going to be afraid to be free if you think that, hey, I don't want to be responsible. I'm willing to give up my freedom in order for you to somehow guarantee outcomes. In fact, Hayek, in a book that he wrote in 1944, it's called The Road to Serfdom. And there's a section in The Road to Serfdom where he says that the government may have to have a social safety net. The government may have to provide some minimal social safety net. Why is that? Because people will be afraid to be free. That's what he says. That's what he's saying here in 1960. He's repeating what he said in 1944. But he's saying, hey, you know what? Maybe we got to have some sort of minimum level of standard of living that people are going to be guaranteed somehow. We're going to tax folks to give stuff away to these people in order to make it so that people are at least willing to accept some freedom in some free society. And so there are, you've probably heard people that are running for president talk about having a guaranteed income, right? Guaranteed minimum income. Actually, Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, was at the University of Chicago and is a pretty free market person. If you can, get on YouTube and look at some of the interviews that he had and some of the programs that he had. He wrote a book called Free to Choose, along with his wife, and there was a PBS series on Free to Choose. But anyway, he suggested what he called a negative income tax, which was basically a guaranteed income. When your income was zero, then that's the amount that you got. And then, of course, as your income rose, it was taxed away. Your benefits were taxed away, but not at 100%. And you didn't have any welfare programs. You just had a guaranteed income if you made nothing, and then everybody paid the same marginal tax rate as you went along. So this idea of, there might have to be some social safety net is recognized by people who believe in individual liberty because people will be afraid to be free. And so this, that's probably why you have some of the programs. Now, what happens if people aren't responsible is they'll change their behaviors. And he says that, why do we want to have people be responsible? Okay, so we assign responsibility for two reasons. One is people behave differently. In fact, in particular, they'll make more efficient use of resources, including their knowledge. If you know that you're going to be rewarded for, you're being rewarded if you were to invent a cure for Ebola, okay, then what's going to happen is you will take on the risk of being innovative, right? That's the idea of profit. When we talked about profit, one of the roles of profit, we said, was people being rewarded for taking on the risk of innovation. And so innovation happens in places where people are responsible for their actions. Why does Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg, why did all these people drop out of college? They all dropped out of college in order to start a company with not a guarantee that, you know, Apple was going to do well, or Facebook was going to do well, or Microsoft was going to do well. They didn't have a guarantee of that. They undertook that risk. Why did they undertake that risk? Because they were going to be rewarded if they were successful. So the idea of why do I want people responsible for their actions? Because they'll behave in a way that creates innovation. They'll behave in a way that makes better, efficient, and more efficient use of resources. If you're not responsible for, let's say you don't have to pay for water, and you live in the, San Joaquin Valley of Fresno, or Central California, like Fresno or Merced or Bakersfield or whatever, or you live in Arizona. What will happen is you'll have all sorts of green lawns, right? You'll have, because you're not paying for the water, and so what will happen? The water will get overused in the same way that when we did our little experiment with the white rhinoceros, right? That is, it'll become a common property resource. People aren't going to have to pay for it. What will happen? They'll use it until the marginal benefit's zero. And so you'll get inefficient use of water. You get inefficient use of whatever product it is that people aren't responsible for. They don't have to pay for it. So if you're not responsible for your actions, you'll behave in a way that you won't work as hard, right? We talked about this right on before the midterm. We talked about how do I get people to work hard. That was what Mises was talking about. This is the problem that there's the information problem and the incentive problem that central planners can't overcome. And one of the problems of the incentive was, how do I get people to work hard? Well, I get people to work hard by them being responsible for their actions. If they're not responsible for their actions, they're not going to work hard. They're not going to innovate. I mean, some people might. Some people probably will. But systematic people working hard, systematic people innovating isn't going to happen. So we want people to make more efficient use of resources. And the other thing is that if you're not responsible, those who are will coerce you. So, or will coerce you. So if what's going on is we're trying to have have individual liberty, we can't have individual liberty if somebody else is responsible for what we're going to do. So suppose that we have a law that says some banks are too big to fail. And if that bank takes on, investments that don't work out, or it takes on too many deposits, and then uses that money to do crazy things with it, and it loses the money, the government's going to take care of all that. The government's going to take care of the bondholders and the stockholders and the depositors, etc. Well, then what will happen? Then you'll have 2,400 pages of the Dodd-Frank Act, where the government tells the banks, here's exactly how you have to do these things, right? Anytime somebody else is responsible for your actions, they're going to tell you, here's how you're supposed to behave. If you are learning to drive, okay? When you're learning to drive, what happens? Your parents are responsible for your actions. So what will happen? They'll tell you, okay, you can't drive at night, or you can't have other people in the car with you that'll distract you. You can't take your friends somewhere. My daughter, I didn't allow her to use the radio because I didn't want her to be distracted while she was driving. And so, she might have wanted to listen to the radio while she was driving, but I didn't let her do that. Okay. Why not? Because I was responsible for their actions. So if you want to have a maximum of individual liberty, if you want to have a maximum of you being able to act according to your own plan, which is what we talk about liberty, then people have to be responsible for their actions. If you say the government's going to take care of you if your house is wiped out in a flood, then what's going to happen? The government's going to have a law that says, no, you can't build in the flood zone, or if you build in this area, then you have to have your house has to be a certain amount of feet off the ground or whatever. So there'll always be, anytime somebody else is taking responsibility for you, they're going to provide, they're going to tell you, here's what you've got to do. So in particular, government is with that. Then he says responsibility has to be not just a legal concept, but it has to be a moral concept, right? So we can have laws about you being about it, but you have to believe in them, right? That is, what he means here is you have to believe in the system. If you don't believe that people should be responsible for their actions, then what's going to happen is, over time, they're going to overthrow the system. If you say, hey, if you were, let's say you were a presidential candidate and you win, and you have a number of people that believe the same way that you do, and they control the House and the Congress, and the way they think is that you're not responsible for actions. Your place in the world is due to the market capitalists who have taken over everything, and that's why you're poor. Okay, if that's the way you believe in it, then you're going to say, hey, this market capitalist system is something we ought to get rid of, right? There's 2 issues ago, maybe 3, there was a headline story, cover story in The Economist called Socialist Millennials. And it's talking about how there's all sorts of folks out there now that don't believe in the system, right? They don't believe in the market capitalist system because they don't believe that people should be held responsible for their actions. Well, you can get rid of the system, but what's the problem? The problem is, as Mises talked about, is how do you overcome this information is decentralized? How do you overcome this problem of incentives to innovate and incentives to work hard? So what Hayek says is that if you guys don't believe in it as a moral concept, then what's going to happen is you're going to overthrow the system. And when you overthrow the system, then you can't really have individual liberty. In fact, he says, a free society depends more than any other that people be guided by a sense of responsibility for their actions. Now, I was testifying in the Michigan Senate one time, and I read that part to them, to the senators, which they had not had anybody read Hayek to them before, unless it was me, unless it was I back when I was in the Senate. But anyway, what was I trying to tell them? That they had a bill that was making it so that someone else was responsible for your actions, right? There was a bill that made it so that whoever did this, it wasn't their responsibility. It was somebody else that was going to have to pay for all this. And so what did I want to make the point? I wanted to make the point that if you're going to have a free society, people have to be held responsible for their actions. He also says that we want people to act as a reasonable being, right? We want people to act as reasonable beings. That is, we want them to use their intelligence. We want to use their knowledge of where they are. We want them to do that because A, it's going to produce more stuff, and B, it will make the system so that we'll be able to have a maximum of individual liberty and a minimum of total amount of coercion. Then he says that it's important for altruism as well, right? Altruism, right? That his responsibility is important for, you can't be altruistic if you're not responsible, right? If I take your stuff away and give it to somebody else, then you haven't been altruistic. Notice that's exactly what Bastiat said in 1850, when Bastiat was saying that exact same thing, that he says voluntary associations are just, involuntary ones are unjust. That is, and he talks about false philanthropy, right? This issue of when the government is redistributing stuff, it is false philanthropy. It's not true philanthropy. Hayek is saying exactly the same thing here. Altruism requires that you be responsible to say, yeah, I'm willing to give my stuff up for these people over here. I'm willing to take care of the poor little match girl. I'm willing to form a society, we're going to form some organization like the Red Cross to take care of people. That's a responsibility that we have as a society. If the government's not going to be taking your stuff, if you're going to be a truly altruistic society, that's what's going to happen. The Soviet Union, people weren't altruistic. And in fact, in Russia today even, it's very hard to find altruism in Russia because they went from the Tsarist period, they went from basically a feudal system to communism. And they didn't ever have a point where people were free to act according to their own plan or responsible for their actions. The government always, either the Tsar told them or the central planner told them, here's what you're going to do. Here's where you're going to live. Here's what we're going to make, etc. So these people were never responsible for their own actions. And so this sense of altruism just doesn't exist in Russia the same way that it does and has in the West. He says moral esteem is meaningless without freedom, right? And we talked a bit ago about Dominic Jacobetti. I said was chairman of the House Ways and Means or House Appropriations Committee for a number of years in the state of Michigan, and had all sorts of infrastructure and other things done for the Upper Peninsula. And there's a road out there, a section of the highway that's called the Dominic Jacobetti Highway, right? Well, that may be well, and we're honoring Dominic Jacobetti because he engaged in legalized plunder and was able to take your stuff and give it to people up in where we were living, okay? But it didn't mean that Dominic Jacobetti was altruistic or philanthropic or whatever, right? He just took your stuff and gave it to somebody else. He was not being altruistic. Again, why do we find that the United States is one of the most altruistic places in the world? Because it's one of the places where you're most free to act according to your own plan. Then he says that a market society success depends not only on native ability, but how well you use your skills. Okay? So in a market, success depends on how well you use your ability. And notice you have that in athletics, right? In sports, professional sports as well as other sports, you don't get rewarded. You don't get to be the champion because you had the most native ability. Tiger Woods probably had lots of native ability, but he also worked really hard. And then what happened was Tiger Woods didn't all of a sudden lose all his native ability, and he wasn't performing as well, and for a number of reasons. But nonetheless, the bottom line is you don't get to keep saying, "Oh well, all sorts of native ability still gets to be champion," right? If you are you might have heard of baseball player Pete Rose. Didn't have lots of native ability, but worked really hard. Ty Cobb worked really hard, became very successful. You watch the NC2A basketball tournament. It's the champion's not going to be the one that says, oh yeah, we found the people that had the most native ability, and so you might as well just announce that we're champions. They got to perform, and if you don't perform, then you're not going to do well, right? You're going to blow a 13-point lead in the second half and lose the Big Ten championship. Not that could happen, but anyway, it did happen. Although when I was working in Lansing, we had Michigan State was the team that we followed, right? We had season tickets to the Spartans football, etc. And then two of my kids went to University of Michigan, so then I couldn't quite decide who to root for, but I was sort of leaning U of M because I knew my kids would be mad if they didn't win. But anyway, his point is here that you have to perform, right? Success depends on your being responsible for your actions and that you perform, which puts really a burden that is placed on you by freedom. You guys, when you graduate, are going to have to go out there and figure out, hey, here's where my ability can be best used. Here's where I'm going to produce the most valuable marginal product. That, nobody's just going to say, oh yeah, you must have been smart. You graduated from Hillsdale College, therefore we're going to give you this job. That's not the way it's going to work. You might have performed well at Hillsdale College, but you still got to perform well in whatever job you might land. Then he also points out that responsibility can only exist for actions that are yours and within your foresight. Right? So you're responsible for actions that are within your foresight and are your actions. It doesn't make sense if we sort of think about why we have responsibility. We have responsibility to do what? To get you to behave in a more efficient way and to make it so that other people don't coerce you, that we have a minimization of coercion. Well, therefore, if you couldn't have known something was going to happen, then we wouldn't need you to be responsible for your actions because you wouldn't have behaved differently, right? Because you didn't know it was going to happen. So if you truly have an accident, then what will happen? We don't make you responsible for that action, okay? Now, in my law and economics class, we talk about what's called tort law and when you might be held responsible for your actions. You might not have known the accident was going to happen, but you should have foreseen that you shouldn't have been going 85 miles an hour in a 55, okay? So if I make you responsible for the accident, if you are undertaking things which increase the probability of having an accident, then you'll behave differently. And so how do you optimally assign responsibility? How do you optimally assign it? Because in law and economics, one of the things we talk about is how do you have the optimum amount of precaution, which where the added benefit of the precaution is just equal to the added cost, right? We do everything where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, right? So what we're trying to do is say, okay, you're responsible if such and such happens. We're going to try to make it, you're responsible in a way to make you behave in the most efficient fashion. If you're not responsible, you're not going to take precaution, right? So we want people to take the efficient amount of precaution. So the same thing here is that I don't need you, I'm not going to hold you responsible for something where you took the proper amount of precaution, this was just a pure accident, because you wouldn't have behaved any differently. If we also want to make it so that other people aren't coercing you, okay, then we should make you only responsible for your own actions. Okay? If what happens is that we say that you're responsible for the actions of someone else, then how can you behave differently other than to try to coerce them? So if you're going to be responsible, if you're let's say you're a Hutu And what happens is we say, okay, you're responsible for the actions of other Hutus. Just because we're going to say any Hutu that does this, all Hutus will be responsible for that. Then what do you get? Then you get tribal warfare, right? How do you get the Hatfields and McCoys? You probably heard the story of the Hatfields and McCoys, right? And so, how many not heard about the Hatfields and McCoys? Okay. Just look up the Hatfields and McCoys, all right? But it's sort of a famous story about two families, and, et cetera. But bottom line is that how did this feud of the Hatfields and McCoys go on for years? It went on for years because if a Hatfield did something, then all the Hatfields were responsible for what that one Hatfield does. So you can't have tribal warfare if you're only responsible for your own actions. You won't have, and notice where you get tribal warfare, how is that really based on? It's based on this tribal action, right? If you're a member of this tribe, then you're responsible for whatever that tribe did. And that doesn't lead towards market efficiency, right? You look at places where they're having tribal warfare around the world, those aren't places that you decided to go on spring break, right? Nobody said, oh, I guess we'll load up and go to Yemen. I'm presuming nobody went to Yemen over spring break. And why is that, right? The idea is that I want you to be held responsible only for your own actions because you'll behave differently. Now, if the responsibility is important for individual freedom, and it's important for making the most efficient use of resources. There was a congressman from Michigan that thought that people ought to be taxed in order to pay for reparations of folks who were enslaved by other people, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Okay, from a Hayekian standpoint, that doesn't make sense, right? Because if you're going to you can't be held responsible for what your grandparents did. And why is that? Because you can't change your grandparents' behavior; they're dead. All right. And so whether you have reparation, you may want to do it anyway. Maybe that's what you want to do, but it doesn't. It's not saying that you guys are responsible for what your grandparents did. You're not. Okay. You can only be held responsible for your own actions. Chapter 6 is just equality under the law. Again, I said there are some chapters that will just give you an overview that you should read. But notice we said that inequality of income is one of the foundations of liberalism. That's what Mises said. And equality under the law is a foundation of liberalism. Now, for Mises, equality under the law is necessary for market efficiency. For Hayek, equality under the law is important so people can't be coercive. We're trying to limit the government's coercion. The government's supposed to minimize the total amount of coercion. If you have equality under the law, then that will result in less likely to have government coercion than if we don't have equality under the law. So what we'll do for Wednesday is we will spend some time on chapter 7, which is democracy. Again, another one of the foundations of liberalism. So we